Hi everyone, my name is Maxime Chouinard, and today we're going to be talking about the 1767 French officer sword. So, oftentimes we hear that the small sword is not a military sword. And I've showed you a couple of soldier swords before, the épée du soldat, which is close enough to a small sword, but in a much more massive version. Now, today we're going to be talking about the 1767 French officer sword. So this is in the same year as the briquet was instituted and became the official sword, the official saber of the infantry soldier. The Duke of Choiseul also decided to create a pattern for the officer, so the commissioned officer of the French army. So before this pattern, there were no other official officer sword. Officers could buy small swords, they could buy sabers. You do have example of sabers being carried around by French officers, hangers. There were not a lot of regulations regarding this. So in 1767, there's this official pattern that comes up, and this is for, again, as with the briquet, this is for every officer of the French army, so even in the general staff. And actually, this pattern here, this example here, is most probably a sword that belonged to a general staff officer. Why? Mostly because of the length of the blade. So this is the only thing that really differentiates a lower rank officer sword from a general staff officer blade. It's the length. This one is about 80 centimeters long, and usually the regular officer swords are about 70 centimeters long, depending on the regulations. So this is a very typical small sword, really. What characterized the 1767 pattern is mostly the guard. It's brass. It does have a wooden core and a grip, but it is either, depending again on the year of the regulation, this is either a silver wire around it or a copper wire. And in this case, it's copper, and the whole assemblage is brass. Now, the blade, it depends enormously. Some of them, this is a fairly regular one, a diamond-shaped blade. As you can see, very thin, as any small sword, very flexible as well. But you can see blades that are longer, triangular, not longer, but larger, triangular. You see also some Kadishma. So many different types of blades on these. So the blade, apart from the length, doesn't tell us much, but the hilt itself is always the same. So you see the overall decoration. The pommel is very telling. This is very much a telltale of the 1767. The melon shape pommel, as many people call it, which becomes longer and longer as the years go by. And the figure 8 guard is also of a fairly simple design. So really, this is a solid small sword. The guard is a little bit more resistant than most regular small sword you'll see. Also, the blade tang is, at least in this case, a little bit more substantial than your typical small sword. So small swords were used and were carried at war, and this is such an example. Now, why were small swords favored over other types of swords? Couple of things about this. So in the 18th century, the hand-to-hand melee combat becomes rarer and rarer. the accent is put on, of course, on the gun, on the musket, but also on a little bit of the bayonet. But really, battles are mostly decided by the gun at this point, and troops don't encounter each other very much. Usually, bayonets are drawn when one side takes the advantage. So, um, the officers are not really called on to use their sword so much. Some of them will still have their spontoons if they're on the field. Of course, if you're a general officer, it's unlikely that you'll use your sword, hopefully. But also for matters of duels. And we often in HEMA, we're very quick to separate the military battlefield combat and the dueling type of fencing. But until the mid 19th century and even up to World War One, duels are still an integral part of warfare. You see this in accounts. You see this at the Battle of Pavia, for example, where a German commander wanted to duel another German commander on the other side. So they were one of them were mercenaries. So didn't go very well for that officer. So unfortunately, he was shot as he was trying to convince his opponents to engage in a duel with him. But anyway, this is an example of many duels that took part. You see this during the Napoleonic Wars, of course. You see this during Crimea. You see this even in the World War I and even in the Franco-Japanese conflict in the early 1900s, and in which Japanese and Russian officers fought a couple of duels. So dueling is very much a part of military culture, even between fellow soldiers. And you can say, well, I'm not interested in this. Like, I prefer real battlefield, which at this point becomes a bit of a strange distinction. But dueling was necessary for officers sometimes because, of course, if you refuse a duel, you look crazy. You look weak in front of your men. And if you engage in duel and you lose, then of course the morale of your troops is going to be significantly lessened. So dueling was an important thing to know for officers in case that they had to represent their men in a fencing match, obviously, maybe to the death, maybe to the first blood, but again, dueling was part of military life. So this is such an example. So the 1767 will go on to be used during the Revolution. You'll see this namely in the American Revolution. So you have one example of this sort that was apparently given to Washington by Lafayette himself, and they still have this sword at Mount Vernon. You can see it right here. So again, very similar type. Interestingly, if there's anyone from Mount Vernon listening to this video, on the website it says that the sword is longer because they said, because George Washington was a tall man, so they had to give him a longer sword. That's not really the case. So what you have there is not a regular officer's sword. This is a general staff officer, just like this one. And so it's likely that it was actually Lafayette's sword that you have, which is even better, right? So update your database. All right. So of course, as I was saying, this was used during the Revolution. After, you have another model that comes up, the 1788. Which replace the small sword for a spadroon, and during most of the Napoleonic Wars, the spadroon will be used just as with the British. And just as with the British, the spadroon is not very much liked by the French army. But that's going to be the subject of another video. So I hope you like this video. Again, this sword is for sale right now on my website if you're interested in acquiring a small sword. So small swords are fairly rare here in North America, and I'm selling for actually a quite affordable price considering this is a general staff officer sword. So check my website, isellswords.com, and also do visit my blog, I don't do longsword, RimaMisfits.com. So anyway, I'll see you next time. Thanks.